Here's something.
All right, let's go start. Let's start with a prayer. I've been praying this.
I hear somebody.
Oh,
okay, go ahead.
Well, I've been praying this prayer all throughout November. I think it's kind of fitting. So, in the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Amen. May they rest in peace. Amen. May their souls and souls of all the faithful departed through the mercy of God rest in peace. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Hi.
Evening, welcome.
Hi. We all come Margaret interested funerals. I'm interested in funerals.
So so we have another Friends Food Faith that got kind of postponed from last week because obviously we had the Feast of All Saints, which we start this month of November. And actually, the month of November in the history of the church is almost like its own season in some ways, because it starts with All Saints, which is really the beginning of the holiday season that we usually refer to. And it ends, of course, really with the Feast of the Presentation, traditionally, which happens in February, right? Then, of course, we have a little time off, and then we start Lent, typically pretty soon after that. So we understand this time, though, of November. Primarily what we're really looking at is the end of the liturgical season, right? Because if you look at the calendar, we have this week upcoming is the 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. Then we have Christ the King, which is the last Sunday of the Ordinary Time, last Sunday of the liturgical year. And we start a new year the following Sunday with the first Sunday of Advent, right? So this time of year in November, with the beginning of All Saints, all the way through like the last few Sundays of the liturgical year, the church kind of focuses the attention, and the readings are reflected in the liturgy on Sundays and also during the week, towards the end times, towards our particular judgment. And there's a relationship that as the end of another year comes to a close, the end of time is something that's brought up, and that also calls to mind our own end of our time, right? And it's fitting that we start the month with All Saints. It's funny, I asked some of the kids in the grade school, who particularly are we celebrating on All Saints? Now the answers are All Saints, yeah, of course. But yeah, sure, St. Augustine and St. Peter and St. Gabriel and St. Raphael and all these saints that we know, of course we celebrate all these saints, but they have their own day on the calendar. So who particularly do we celebrate, though, on All Saints?
Probably anybody that's led a good life.
Well, yeah, so we have to understand how we define saint, right?
Big saint or
well, exactly, right? And so we talk the initial definition of saint is anyone that's with God in heaven, right? And so that refers to not only human souls, but angelic, right? Anything that has what we call a rational immortal soul that is with God in heaven is a saint, right? So some people might bring up, like, what about aliens? Yeah, sure, right? They're included in that. Or what about if God were to decide to give a dog intelligence? Yeah, sure, yes, fine, right? The intelligence is the reasoning is what makes actually the soul immortal. That's a gift from God. That we have to recognize that such. So All Saints is really recognizing those saints we don't maybe necessarily know. Those in our families who have gone before us, who maybe we have a child in our family that died before each age of reason and are baptized. They're saints. There's no question about that, right? Maybe some of us in our families have had the fortune of having a priest at our bedside in our deaths that can actually minister the sacraments of anointing of the sick, and or communion, and or maybe even confession, and also apply the apostolic pardon. In those circumstances, we would say unequivocally, they'd be saints. So the point is, we have other saints in heaven than just the ones that the church has canonized and recognized in certain respects because of the virtue of their life, right? And miracles, we have people that maybe miracles aren't attributed to in our families that we would still call saints, because as long as they're with God in heaven, they're a saint. We follow that up to the very next day with the Feast of All Souls, where we commemorate those that are in purgatory. So we have the church triumphant we start with, we have the church suffering, and then for the rest of us, we kind of focus on the church militant, that we're all directed towards that same end. right? So good. And our funeral rites kind of reflect that in many ways, right? In some ways, it's kind of fitting to have a funeral in November because that month of November is directed towards that same end, right? So we have specific traditions that we kind of hold, and specific, some people would say obligations when it comes to what we should do in a funeral rite. Maybe it's first off, it's best to recognize, well, who is eligible to receive the funeral rites?
Does she have to be baptized?
Have to be baptized, maybe.
Maybe. Anybody? No.
Not, yeah. There's actually some restriction. So in other words, would a Muslim person be eligible to receive the Great Christian funeral? It depends. It's kind of an interesting situation. So Jane brought up baptism. Yeah, baptized people, they have that right. So let's say a person maybe was raised Lutheran or Catholic or Baptist and was baptized, and later in life they may have turned away from the faith and turned to Islam or Judaism or Hindu or Buddhism. Would they be eligible for funeral rites? That's a tricky one, right? Because what the church would say is anyone that's baptized and has not been obstinate in their rejection of the faith.
Has not been obstinate.
Right. So is it possible that maybe somebody was practicing Islam and maybe right before they died, they decided to repent? And maybe they were even saying prayer. They said some prayer in their life to actually reflect that. We would err on the side of caution in that respect and say, yeah, because they were baptized Christian, because even though maybe they were practicing this other faith, they didn't necessarily publicly or obstinately deny the faith of Christianity, even though Islam may require that in some ways. As long as it wasn't explicit, we could say, yeah, they would be eligible to receive Christian burial. Catechumens, right? Those who have not been baptized yet, but had the desire to be so, and have started that process, they would be eligible for Christian burial. Now, where is the demarcation line for that, right? It's kind of broad for that too. So right now we have about 17 people who register for our Sunday sessions, right? And not all of them show up every Sunday, but it's been a cycle. But those that have been coming, those that have been kind of engaging, would they be eligible to receive Christian burial?
They have a desire to.
I think we would say yes, right? Now, officially, technically, the process for RCA starts with the rite of acceptance, right? So in other words, there's a rite in the church where people are enrolled as catechumens and candidates in the church. And at that point on, they're considered to be candidates, catechumens. But the rite is kind of open when it talks about when that actually begins. There's a formalization in the rite of acceptance. But if someone's coming to RCA meetings, we would say, yeah, of course, they would be part of that acceptance. Children who are not baptized.
Do all RCIA members have to be baptized?
No, right? No, yeah.
Could be baptized.
So we're talking about like specifically for catechumens, so those who are not baptized. So catechumens are those who are not baptized.
I see.
Candidates are those who may be baptized in another faith, but they would be fully received into the Catholic Church, right? Or even those that have been baptized in the Catholic faith but haven't completed the rites of initiation, we call candidates. Okay.
What are the rites of initiation?
Baptism, confirmation, first communion, right? The sacraments of initiation.
Okay.
Right? So yeah, we have about 17, and so those 17 would, if they were to die, hopefully, please God that doesn't happen. Between now and the time they were fully accepted, we would bury them as if they were Christian, right? Babies who have not been baptized yet, right?
Would you have a mass? I mean,
yeah.
Is there any other way to bury people than? I mean, if they are buried via Christian and they're Catholic, then that's usually a mass that occurs.
Well, so here's the thing. This doesn't say the order of Catholic funerals. It says the order of Christian funerals, right?
Right.
Those are this book says. So that is not limited just to Catholics.
Right.
Now, the rite itself is a continual, we call it continuous rite, right? So it's not RIGTH, not RTE, right? So it's not a one-time event when it comes to a funeral. And we have that in other parts too. So like Christmas, for instance, right? Christmas is actually a season, and the liturgy assumes a continuous rite to the point where even 8 days after Christmas Day is considered to be Christmas Day. We celebrate those days if they were Christmas Day. Easter, right? Easter begins on Easter Vigil, on Holy Saturday, and it ends at midnight on Divine Mercy Sunday. It's continuous Mass that goes on through that entire week, and every day of that week is celebrated as Easter Sunday. We see that same thing in the funeral rite. So it starts with the death of the person. And even within that rite, there are different options. And this is kind of where it gets odd, because compared to what it was pre-Vatican, it was, what's a good word? It was more structured, right? So in other words, after Vatican II, you have a lot more options in the funeral rites. But primarily, there's always been this retained of three types of three kind of parts of the funeral rite. There's the vigil, which kind of happens at the point of the person's death, and that leads into the Mass, right? And within that, there's like prayers right after death. There's prayers in the presence of the body. There's actually a vigil liturgy, right? That includes the liturgy of the Word and Our Father, and then that leads into the actual Mass, and even within that, there's a rite for the transfer of the body to the church. There's a rite for the reception of the body at the church, and then you go into the Mass itself. Then at the Mass, you can do what they call the commendation, which is then part of the committal, right? So you have the vigil, you have the Mass, then you have the committal. That's always been retained, even in the new rites after Vatican II. But what's been added is these other things like, prayers of reception of the body. Part of it's because, well, the way people kind of approach death changed over time. So prior to Vatican II, and really even before Vatican II, a lot of people would die in their own beds, right? There was sort of this kind of communal aspect where if somebody was dying, well, they'd be home, and then maybe a doctor come visit them, and neighbors would come visit and bring food for the family, and even like what we call the wake, which we kind of say would be like a vigil, that would be at people's houses. It would be uncommon in like the early 20th century and even well into the 17th, 18th century, 19th centuries, that people would be laid out in their house, and then you would bring the deceased after this wait time period to the church for the funeral. Right? Now, people are dying in hospital or hospice beds, or people are not necessarily at home when they're passing away. And so we also include the mortuary business that kind of comes in, and now we have embalming techniques and advancements in kind of those technologies that help preserve the body in a better way, right? That we didn't necessarily have before. So the church kind of adapted to these aspects to incorporate that into the liturgy. So yeah, you have these different readings you can pick, right? Now the visual actually you don't pick any readings. They're actually the same readings no matter what. But for the Mass, there's a plethora of readings, and they don't have to use the readings even in the lectionary. You can choose readings whatever you think would be appropriate.
Really?
Yeah.
Ah. So,
like for instance,
it's a family.
Well, let's say you have a couple that maybe one of the husband or the wife dies, and they want to use the readings from their wedding. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. Right? That could be somewhat appropriate, right? so readings, I mean, the readings that we kind of have are that because they're in the lectionary that way, and they do have kind of a theme of either repentance or judgment or resurrection, right? Those kind of things. But it's open. The rite even says, hey, you can choose really whatever readings are appropriate. Well, who determines what's appropriate? The celebrant typically, but also there can be reasonable way to say, yeah, I think these would be better. Uncle Jerry loved these readings. Okay, great, let's use them.
Can a deacon do the reading?
Yes. So a deacon can perform a vigil ceremony. The deacon can do a funeral outside of mass, and that's another kind of new part of this. That we talk about Christian burial. Well, maybe let's say you have a Lutheran that comes to you and says, "I want to get buried out of this church. I want to be buried in the Catholic Church." Okay, they're baptized. They don't deny the faith. All right. Now, we wouldn't necessarily have a mass for them because reasonably, probably the people that are there are not Catholic.
Right.
But you can still bury them with have a rite outside of mass. And that's always kind of been the case. So I wouldn't say it's like a new invention, but there's differences in that though too. You still do accommodation and still do the committal. So deacon can do all of that. The only thing you would need a priest for would be for the mass itself, if there were a mass. Right. So I think it's kind of important to first off understand. So the rite itself actually has these general introductions, right? And so it kind of brings out 2 points in the very beginning. So what is the main point of a funeral?
Respect the body and give it back to God.
I mean, that's part of it. I mean, obviously it's giving back to God. That's really, but more appropriately, the point of the funeral is to pray for the soul that has left that body, and also pray for ourselves who remain, the mourners. But even more particularly, if it came down to the choice between those two, is actually for the mourners, right? Because the funeral is not for the dead; it's for the living. Now, we still pray for that soul. We pray that God would be merciful upon them. We pray for forgiveness of their sins, because also that is considered merit, right? That's a corporal work of mercy to bury the dead, and that's part of the funeral rite, right? Okay. But yeah, but also it's for closure for those that remain, and and that's also kind of interesting, the different methods that are now used, and which can be incorporated in some ways. But part of that is what brings the best closure for those that remain. So over time, there wasn't this question about, okay, well, what do we do with the body? Right? It was, we'll bury the body, right? And there's something in the human way that's kind of finite about that, right? That when a casket the corpse is lowered into a crypt or lowered into a grave and covered over, that's it. That's done, right? And even though maybe the people that remain aren't fully in the mourning process yet, it can help you actually start to mourn in that respect, which is good. It's good to grieve, right? That's healthy. As time's gone on, there's been more invention, so to speak, of what to do with remains. So the first kind of instance of this happened, and this goes back more to pagan times, but there was tradition even in like pagan times, the Greeks, Romans, even the Egyptians. Well, not the Egyptians; they were mummified, but other cultures throughout the world tend to maybe burn the bodies, right? And the church kind of rejected that in many ways because, well, we understand there's the resurrection of the body. And so even though God can bring about our materials and give and create, reproduce the glorified body, regardless of where the remains are, it seems appropriate to keep all the remains intact in some place. And part of that's because, well, as we see here in this picture, Does anyone know what this picture is first off?
Is it St. Peter's?
Yeah, St. Peter's Basilica, right? It's a high altar. And underneath the high altar, you can even see going down into the crypt where there are many martyrs and saints are buried. The Vatican, right, was actually on Vatican Hill. It was a circus. It was a place where sport happened. And especially in the early church, early Christians would be killed. And so instead of hauling their remains somewhere else, it would just be easier to bury them there or put them in the crypts that are there, right? And so in the early church, a lot of the first masses were happening in these sites where these people that we venerate were buried on their tombs, right? So there's always already this kind of understanding that, yeah, it's good to have the body intact. We know where these bodies are, so we come and venerate them, right? And show our respect and give our respects to those that have died. And we can't necessarily do that if their ashes are strewn all over the place, right? Because we don't know where they are now, right? Erosion happens, wind blows. So, I mean, if you're on the sea, well, where's that going, right? So from the very beginning, it's kind of understood, yeah, we want to make sure that the bodies are intact because that was a gift from God. And that came up over time through different heresies that would pop up, right? So in the early church, a lot of the heresies that were kind of coming about were about soul good, body bad. That's basically the gist of it, right? Is that, yeah, okay, well, the soul is really the most important thing because that's our gift from God, and that's what gives us our personalities and our minds and whatever. And the body, well, that's where all the bad stuff comes from, right? That's where our lusts come from. That's where our desires come from. That's where these base things that keep us from God happen. And a lot of the heresies in the early church are kind of in that way, right? Arianism, Nicaeanism, monophysitism, like all these different kind of aspects were like, and they pop up over time too. I mean, there are no new heresies; they're just kind of repackaged in different ways now. But primarily, what most of the heresies come down to: soul good, body bad. What the church says is, no, your bodies are a gift from God, just as your soul is, and you're a body-soul composite. You're not one over the other, right? Your entire personhood, your entire being comes from not only your soul, but also your body. Now, you should treat our bodies well. Some do that better than others. But that's a gift. And there's something sacred about that gift that is recreated or regenerated in a beautiful way, an act of love, a bond of love that is ordained by God. And so because of that, we should respect the body. And also, in most cases, especially with saints, they found that the bodies would not corrupt, which is also evidence that our bodies are gifts too. So what that basically boils down to, yeah, the body should be intact. Okay. So for about 1,800 years, for the most part, that's kind of how the church approached things, right? Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Until the early 1920s, when there was this movement, kind of off the heels of World War I, where there was a lot of kind of an influx of atheism. There's also kind of this kind of cultish type of society where seances became very big, and fortune tellers, and there's kind of the spiritualism that came about, which kind of brought about a new form of atheism and kind of this rejection of the belief that the body is resurrected. And to kind of signify this, people were starting to have their bodies cremated. Back to the old pagan ways of burning it all up and keep it all together, fine. But if you want to screw them all over the place, whatever. If you want to bury them, fine. But this kind of understanding that okay, the resurrection body is not a thing, and so therefore it doesn't matter with your body. Again, soul good, body bad. And so, who cares? And the church initially, when this was kind of started, said that's not what we want to do. And when cremation started becoming popular, the church kind of rejected it because, well, you're denying the resurrection of the body by doing this. Over time, there was kind of understanding, well, maybe you can be cremated because of cost, or because of environmental impact, or maybe it's just better and easier. not rejecting that tenet of the faith that the body is resurrected, and that can't be your intention when it comes to cremation. But the church said, okay, fine, as long as your intention is not that the body is not going to be resurrected, cremation can be a licit way of disposing of the body. But and this even goes with maybe even people that are buried. Where are you going to put the ashes? Or where are you going to put the remains or the cremains? Because we do have a committal process, right? That's part of the funeral rite too. That we kind of have that last goodbye. And so even though there's not this maybe burying of the body, there should be some kind of finality involved in the grieving process in the morning that's healthy for human beings. Well, I was going to keep grandma up on the mantle. Okay, great. What happens to grandma when you die? Or your children? Or any of your other relatives? What then? What happens if grandma falls off the mantle for some reason? Also, if we understand this understanding of the respect of the body that needs to be venerated, which is really why we have markings and tombs, right, that show this person, there's something that with dignity and respect buried here that should be respected and given dignity. Well, part of our understanding of these things, and really the month of November is kind of directed towards this too, that in November we're called as Christians to visit cemeteries and pray for the dead. And as a matter of fact, there's an indulgence that comes along with that, right? So are you going to open up your living room so people can actually come and venerate grandma publicly? Because it can't just be a private, it has to be open to the public. Are you going to, put hours on when that's going to happen? Where strangers come into your house and actually do this? Oh, well, I don't know if that's a good idea. Okay. Well, maybe we'll just sprinkle grandma over some flowers or put it out. Okay, but now you're not maintaining the dignity of the body. Or you're not keeping grandma intact. And even though God can do these things, we also have to respect grandma's body in that way. And that doesn't seem very respectful. I will say recently, without my knowledge, I was asked after someone's funeral to come out to the botanical garden and bless a brick that this person had in honor of this person that died. And I agreed, sure, fine, sounds good. And so the person asked me to come out earlier. He wanted to surprise his daughter, the fact they were going to bless this brick, and I was like, okay, great, sounds good. Well, they told me to be there I'll be there at 10, great. They didn't get there till 11, it started raining. And so at this point, so I see them, I come over to bless this brick. And right before I bless it, I noticed this person takes out a little baggie with a straw in it. And I was like, oh, that's very interesting. And so he takes out this straw, and then in it, he kind of puts a little bit of this dust into the brick. And it's raining, right? So, I mean, it's not like it's going to stay on the brick. And I found out after he did it that was part of his wife's ashes. Now, if I knew that beforehand, I probably would have said no, right? Or I probably would have put up a fight. But at that point, it was like, well, what are you going to do? After the fact, right? So it's one of these things where we have to recognize that the body is sacred. We want to maintain that sacredness of it. And it doesn't seem dignified or proper to spread ashes or remains strewn about, whether it's in nature or on a man-made thing, because you can't then control where those remains go. Currently, there's an issue. There's new ways they're developing of these things where It's called hydrology. I believe I brought this up before. I don't know if you guys remember this, but there's basically compression of the remains down to this fine powder. But the problem with that is all the other material is then dumped into the sewer. And that doesn't seem proper. Another kind of trendy thing people are doing now is making their family members into jewelry. So compressing them into like rings and earrings and necklaces. Which again, the same thing would kind of, well, what happens after you die? Well, let's say you lose grandma, somewhere, jewelry slips off, that happens. Then what? So, I think we have to take this position that, it's best just to do what we know is right, rather than trying to be inventive, right? Because ultimately, now there are certain situations maybe where a family member puts into their will, this is what they want to do. And in those instances, it kind of gets a little bit hairy because, okay, you may have a legal obligation to do this. Maybe there's inheritance involved that really would help you out. And if you didn't do this, that would actually affect you in some way. Yeah, I think we have to look at the reasons behind these things. And so the question would be, would that be your fault or the person that is requiring you to do this? I think you can make an argument there. But yeah, sometimes that becomes very awkward in your decisions. And so, and you have to be very clear sometimes about what is actually happening and what I can actually do for you, even to the point where I can't consciously do this for you, witness, perform the rites, if I know this is going to happen. And it's a willful action, not anything else going on with it.
Well, you almost have to kind of dig a little deeper when they ask you to do something like that.
Well, I will say, like, when I meet with a family, I kind of have a checklist. And so usually when I meet with a family, what I'll say first is, okay, well, here's thinking, for instance, okay, well, let's talk about, do you want to have a vigil, right? And a vigil will usually happen before the visitation, whether that's in the church or at the funeral parlor. We also can provide like a rosary. So one of those two things, maybe if you want to do those, I'd be happy to lead that if you want, but I don't have to. I can give you the right if you want to do it as a family. That's okay. And that's true. Lay people can actually do the rites too, right? There's one there. They make distinction between whether it's a lay minister or ordained in the rite. Their prayers are a little bit different, but you can do it. Ideally, you would only do that if there's no clergy available. That's kind of the stipulation. If there's clergy available, you should have a clergy do it. Otherwise, yeah, sure, fine. And then I'll say, okay, well, let's talk about the actual mass. So I first asked if anyone stream the mass here, Gabriel, so we have that now. Then we talk about, okay, what about servers? You have servers in the family, right? That want to do this. If not, we can provide them. Let's talk about readings. So you can have first reading from the Old Testament. If it's Easter time, you can have New Testament readings, a couple. A psalm or a responsorial. Do you have a cantor? Do you have readers for those things in the family? Or do we have to provide them? Second reading is optional. You don't have to have a second reading in the funeral mass. Most people have it, but you don't have to. That comes from the New Testament. We do need a gospel. So, gospel, you go to one of the 4 gospels. Petitions. So we have petitions in the book. You can use it as a structure, make your own, or write them all from scratch, whatever you want to do. Do you have a reader for those petitions? Or should I do that? Or one of the clergy? Offertory, do you want to read some people to remember the gifts? About how many people do you think are going to be there? Because, we may need extraordinary ministers. And if so, do you have anyone in the family that can do that? Okay, then let's talk about words of remembrance. So in the rite, there are basically 4 points where what they call words of remembrance can be used. The vigil, there actually is in the rite explicitly in the vigil. You can do it within the mass at certain points. I typically do it after the prayer for communion, before the commendation. I think that's an appropriate time to do it.
When is that?
So after the mass is over, we have the prayer for communion, and then we go to the commendation, right? So that's usually kind of a natural break between the committal service and the. Now, but people I've seen done after the homily, which isn't necessarily wrong, but also it's not necessarily proper. You could do the very beginning before Mass begins. I've had that happen a couple times. Especially when we have visitation in the church. It's just guys, you're just, okay, why don't you get their attendance before Mass starts? Do what you gotta say, don't start Mass. Or you could do it at the committal, like right before the committal at the gravesite. Right? So those are kind of three main places where you can do it. How should I put this? The Archdiocese has guidelines. It says no more than 5 minutes and probably no more than 2 people for those 5 minutes. Most people will probably go over that. I've heard some good ones, but I've heard more bad ones than good ones personally. What I just personally ask family members if they're going to do the words of remembrance, I would like to see an outline. Because I've heard some where it was just kind of very inappropriate. Or it was downright just nasty. Like basically it was airing or sour grapes. And it's like, this is not the place to do that. So I typically ask for that personally. Now, not every priest may do that. I don't know. It kind of just depends. But I think it's also important for families, and we talk about this too, words of remembrance are not about a drinking story that you had with your husband or your brother. It's really meant to actually foster an understanding of his faith life, his or her faith life. Because we're still in the context of liturgy here. If you want to talk about the drinking stuff, do it at the reception, right? You can talk all you want about how you guys got drunk and went out to a sorority house and did a panic. Fine, whatever. You can do that at the reception. That's not the proper time within the Mass and the place that we're doing this. So I try to avoid, I really try to deter having the words of remembrance at the Mass personally. But I think also too, sometimes turns more into catharsis for the person giving it than actually what it's meant to be. And that's not necessarily bad, but that doesn't have to be in the Mass. You can do that some other time. Also, so then I asked the question about the committal. Oh, okay, where are you gonna have the committal? Yeah. Okay, where? And do you want me to be a part of that? Now, if they say no, my next question is, oh, okay, well, what are you going to do with the remains? We're doing it by the science. Okay. And that also raises some interesting questions because my next question after that, oh, well, who's going to be taking care of the remains then who are you donating to? Because, well, I would say there was a point here in St. Louis where most universities here, or colleges you donate a body to, they would do a committal later, or some form of committal, which would be appropriate. In other words, the remains be remain intact and to be buried once they're done with them. Good. I don't think that's the same. I don't think it's happening today. Even some quote unquote Catholic institutions, I don't know if they're necessarily handling their remains correctly. And so I don't have any evidence of that, but I would advise anyone that's planning to do that to make sure they do their research and make sure that what's going to happen with the remains are going to actually be done properly. Meaning they're going to be intact and preferably buried, or at least put into a place where they can be venerated. I know WashU has kind of turned away from that. They're not necessarily doing that. So again, I would just word of caution on that. Then I asked for homily fodder, and I kind of explained to the family that the purpose of the funeral homily is to flow from the readings that we're using. And it's meant to do 2 things for the deceased. It's meant to divinize them. They were a great husband, wife, mother, father, and humanize them, right? So you like to sit back with you every once in a while, have a good time. Maybe went to the boats. Maybe you enjoy knitting or sport, something people can actually relate to. And that's kind of what I asked the family for those type of things in our meetings. So yeah, the committal, that's kind of when I found out what's going on. And so I always ask that question in my meeting with the family. Oh, okay, the committal. So you want to be part of that. Typically, the funeral parlor already knows what's going on, and they'll let us know that. But I always like to make sure, that that's going on too, to ensure that it's actually being done properly. So the committal, that's at the graveside or at the columbarium if you have ashes that are being interred. It takes about 10 minutes, but that's also structured too. There's really no deviation there. It's pretty straightforward, the commendation and the committal work. The Mass, things can change. There's different prayers you can use. There's different readings you can use. But the vigil and the committal are kind of solid as far as their structure is concerned. You don't really deviate too much in those. Everything else though is kind of adaptable in some ways. I think it's important to recognize that the whole purpose of the funeral is really, again, to bring closure to us so we can actually start the grieving process or maybe end it, depending on where people are in their mourning. But also pray for the soul that has passed, and then pray for ourselves who remain. So that's kind of the purpose of the reason why we do what we do in those aspects. And there's a psychological level of these things too. And I'm kind of, as a priest, we're actually required within 3 years of our ordination to actually give our preferences to the archdiocese. I haven't done that yet. So, but because I'm still kind of debating as far as cremation compared to buried, and I don't know. I mean, I see the advantages of both, but also I think there is a level of closure involved when you actually can witness the body being lowered and buried, where you don't necessarily get that with a columbarium or ashes. I don't know. I'm still kind of debating that. So good. Questions, comments, concerns, heresies?
I was at a funeral, Catholic funeral, and so the witness came up. So the priest left. I mean, everything was gone. The Mass was over and so forth and so on. So then the priest, the people got up. I think 2 people got up and gave their eulogy at that time. So he didn't have to be there. So.
Oh, you mean like after he was processed out?
Yeah.
Well, was it a funeral or memorial mass?
It was a funeral mass.
So did yeah, go ahead.
The body was present. Okay.
And did they take the casket out and then they gave the speech? Because usually the priest process, and you pray back there too. It feels like. Yeah, okay, that's a good point. You'll notice, like in the Mass, we don't start Father, Son, Holy Spirit, right? We just go, may the peace of Lord Jesus Christ. Right. Yeah. And we don't end with the dismissal of the Mass either. We don't say go in peace. What we say is let us take our brother or sister to their place of rest. Mm-hmm. And so technically what's supposed to happen is this is on the right, the procession begins to the place of rest. Mm-hmm. And so basically when we process out, that's the time to take the pall off, right? And that's the right, that's part of the right too. And then bring the casket or the remains either right there to the graveyard if you have a graveyard or a gravesite at the place, or then start the procession for the drive, right? That's all in this book. And so to have I think it'd be more appropriate to actually have it at the end of the procession. Because there's kind of a demarcation at that point liturgically, a stoppage, or so to speak, between the actions of that liturgical action and the new liturgical action. So, like I said, what this basically, I'll say exactly what it says here in the rubric for these things. So after the commendation, the deacon or the absent deacon, the priest says, "In peace, let us take our brother or sister to his place of rest. If a symbol of the Christian life has been placed on the coffin, it should be removed at this time." So that's the pall, right? Or anything else. The procession then begins. The priest and assisting ministers precede the coffin. The family and new mourners follow. One or more of the following texts or other suitable songs will be sung. They have some versions here. And this following song we use. And then it goes into the actual committal. So there's a liturgical action break at the end of the procession, and then the start of the committal service. So I don't.
So how they do it? I mean, what did?
So basically,
You know,
he
it
said
was a memorial mass. It was not a.
Well, if the body was present, it's the funeral.
Yeah.
If there was no body, it's a memorial mass, and yeah, at that point, the priest would say, "Go with the peace of Christ, thanks be to God," and then you can go.
It was not. I think.
Okay. Now I have seen it go that way, where like a priest will process out the funeral, and then someone will get up there and it's like, I mean, it's not proper. It's not liturgically proper, right? And I think especially for younger priests, people kind of get on our case a little bit about our rigidity. I'm not trying to be rigid. I'm just trying to do because there are legitimate times where that can be done within the liturgy. But it seems like we're saying, that doesn't really matter. Your feelings and the way you want to do it really matters more. And I don't necessarily agree with that.
Well, I can see there's a flow.
Yeah. Because that's the thing. You're kind of breaking up the flow by doing that. If I'm beginning the procession as the ministers and the priests, and the coffin's still behind me, and the guy's getting up there and speaking, well, that's not part of the liturgy. Now you're causing a break where there wasn't a break.
So how did they? Okay, we're being cremated. And even though I know you'd like the body to be there, it just seems like if you're going to finish it off by going to the cemetery and burying the box,
right?
Then the remains should be, or what's there.
Yeah.
But who just somebody carry them out or?
Yeah. I mean, even with the cremains, I mean, so there actually is. They have it right here for the cremains, and so
the index.
Yeah, so when the committal is delayed, so here's the thing that's kind of fascinating about this, and none of us do it this way. What this assumes is that the body is present for the mass, and that the actual cremation happens later.
Yes, I know. Right?
Yeah,
you said that.
Now, nobody does that. So okay. Not necessarily a big deal, but in that respect, if cremation was already done, the idea would be you process out with the cremains.
Because I mean, you couldn't do the commitment,
right? And
then you'd have to.
Yeah, and so it says here
some other time,
right? So that's why they have an alternate form dismissal when it comes to cremains. So what it says here, when the committal is delayed, or when the body is to be cremated before internment, the deacon, or in the absence of the priest, says the following similar words. So instead of "let us take our brother," it says, "In the sure hope of the resurrection, we take leave of our brother or sister. Let us go in peace."
See you later.
And the intention would be later, you would meet up at the funeral part at the cemetery, and then complete the committal rite.
Yeah.
So technically, you could say, even if you have the remains, you could say, well, as soon once that's said, you're then at a natural break at that point. So really, you don't necessarily have to have a procession out. But assuming that the body is still there and not cremated, you still process out anyway, and then do all the cremation later, and then come back for the committal. So yeah, I mean, it's just depends on the circumstance you find yourself in. So even in that instance, let's say you have cremains, and the priest or deacon says that. Well, okay, you could say there maybe is a natural break there because it doesn't necessarily assume procession out with the cremains.
It still feels like it would break up the flow.
Well, it wouldn't, because I think in the latter, we were talking about the cremain portion. There is no procession because the procession is supposed to be the procession to the cemetery. But we're not processing to the cemetery yet, right? We're processing to the crematory. So, okay, that's not liturgical. I mean, there are prayers you can actually say before the cremation. That's actually in here too. But it wouldn't be, but that could also be a natural break in the actual liturgy because, okay, we're not actually starting the procession now. We're doing that later. But again, that would all assume what's going on there. The assumption is the body's still there. It hasn't been cremated yet. If you already have cremains, well, presumably you would actually start the procession then to go to the committal. Because there's no stopping at the crematory. It's just straight up to the columbarium or the cemetery. So it all depends there, and that's why as the priest you have to be kind of cognizant of those things. Because like I will say it's kind of funny. I've had several funerals where you're assuming there's a body and there's not. There's cremains, like, oh, well, okay, well, you don't have to do the pall. Okay, now we have to change the way we're going to do this. So the wording is going to be a little different, okay. And now, well, could now there be a words of remembrance after the dismissal? Well, if there's cremains, yeah, no, but if it's still the body, yeah. So it's kind of, I don't think people necessarily process that. I mean, a lot of people also don't realize the difference between a funeral and a memorial mass either. It's memorial masses, there's no body. Funeral masses, there's a body. And also, it's important to understand too, it's only one funeral mass. So I think sometimes, and this maybe happens through miscommunication or misunderstanding. Sometimes what you have, and I had a similar situation this past week, where you have a family who may be living out of town, person dies, they have the funeral mass there, but they're getting buried somewhere else. And so this particular family would have another funeral here in St. Louis, even though they've already had the funeral mass somewhere else. And so it's like, no, we can't do that, right? You've already had the funeral. Now what we can do is, if he's being buried here, we can have a committal and then do the memorial mass later, like that same day. I mean, and what happened was they had the committal and we came right back to the church and did the memorial mass. Okay. But I don't think people realize that. It's one funeral mass. That's all we do. Now we have as many memorial masses as you want, but we can't have the body there. That's the main difference. Yeah, it's fascinating.
It is.
But I think a lot comes down to ignorance. And
how did the practice get started of having masses said for people's who had passed away or people's intentions?
That's all. So every mass ever said has always had intention, whether it's been a priest's personal intention or the intention for the mass that's given. So typically, this is kind of even ancient. In order to actually celebrate the mass, there's always an understanding that there's a goodwill offering given to the priest, right? And part of that goodwill offering actually goes to Levitical rites, like Levites, right? So if you look at Leviticus and the laws of Moses, they're told specifically to give the priests certain portions for their survival, for their living, right? Because their job is to administer in the temple. Their job is to take care of those ceremonial practices. So because they're not farmers and they're not, making a living anywhere else, God provided for his priests and Levites through these goodwill offerings that were supposed to be given by the people. And so actually, to answer your question then, Marilyn, that actually comes from the Jewish tradition, that in the order of Melchizedek that a priest is ordained to, the intention or the goodwill offering you're giving is for the intention of that mass to provide for the good of the priest. Now you can say, well, how far does $10 go? Well,
is the stipend for the funeral mass?
Let's be careful. Let's be careful.
Okay.
It's not a stipend.
Okay. What is it?
It's a stips.
Oh.
Here's the difference. A stipend is what you would pay a mercenary. A stips is a goodwill offering.
How do you spell it?
S-T-I-P-S.
Stips.
Mm-hmm. So here's the other thing too. I mean, when it comes to these ceremonial or these I should say it's not a votive, it's oh man, what's the type of mass we celebrate there? Yeah, because it is a votive. I don't know. It's not a devotional, it's a votive. So these masses that are kind of extra, it's kind of the same thing would apply. You want to give a goodwill offering to the priest. Now, for a daily mass, how much do you spend on a daily mass? $10. That's the goodwill offering for a daily mass for intention, right? There is no stipulation about how much the goodwill offering can be maximum. The $10 mark actually comes from the canon law of the archdiocese. It's a particular diocese that actually determines that for the intention. That the point of that again is to go to the good of the priest. So how much does $10 a day go? Well, I can get a sandwich of that, I suppose. That'd be fine. When it comes to like funerals and weddings, well, okay. And here's something else to be cognizant of too. I don't talk to the families about the money they give. That's completely up to them. Because part of this is understanding that we don't celebrate the sacraments to get paid. That actually is a whole heresy, and it was actually determined very early in the church that should never happen. And it came from this from actually the Bible in the Acts. There's this guy named Simon the magician that he saw what the apostles were doing and all these things they were doing, and said, "Oh, I want to get on that so we can make money." And so he got baptized, became a priest, and he started charging people to celebrate the sacraments. And they called that simony. And the brothers had to get together and say, no. And he actually got excommunicated because he wouldn't stop. So the church is very cognizant. Now, again, the $10 that's a free will offering, and the thought is that, well, that's not a really impactful price. That should be pretty easy to give. And it doesn't really, I mean, but also too, it's not like it's breaking one's bank, but also you're not necessarily paying for the priest to celebrate sacraments. You're paying for, or you're actually using that for the intention. But in the same way, you could also go to the priest and ask if you just have that intention personally without paying him. And I think most priests say, yeah, sure, no problem, right? So when it comes to these things, sometimes what you'll find, especially from different funeral parlors, they charge you already for the clergy fee. And
do they pass it along?
Yes.
Okay.
But depending on which place it is, some charge up to $300. Now somebody say, well, that seems reasonable. Okay. I don't make that charge though. That's not Father Madden or St. Gabriel saying, yeah, you should charge the family $300. That is the funeral parlor doing that.
Do they give what they charge, or do they keep some of it?
As far as I know, I mean, all I know is I get a check.
Okay.
I never asked for the check. And I would even say it's somewhat obscene sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
An example of that. This was not a funeral mass or even a funeral liturgy. The family wanted a priest to come and just pray with them at the reception, at the visitation. So we got called over here, went over this funeral parlor. I was there for a total of maybe 5 minutes, if that. And I really was like a third. I did basically the prayer of commendation, which takes 30 seconds. As I was walking out the door, I was given a check for $200. Now, I felt dirty because I was like, I was here for 5 minutes. And it's kind of an awkward position because you can say, well, I'll just give this back to the family. But also, that puts them in a bad position because they have to do that. And also kind of, it doesn't show the appreciation, right? So I don't talk when it comes to weddings and funerals, anything about the cash. Sometimes people bring it up, how much should we pay you? I'm like, you don't pay me. I'm not doing this to get paid. If you want to give some money, great. I'm not going to dictate to you what that would do. You should probably pay the cantor if we have a cantor, because that's actually part of their living. And that's a just wage for them. If we have servers, usually it's customary to give them a couple dollars. But if you don't do that, I'll do it. So whatever. But also, yeah, you don't pay me. How much should we pay the church? Well, part of that is how much you think is appropriate. Typically we ask for about $400, and that's just because we have to pay for, the communion wafers and the wine and to keep the electricity on and turn the air conditioner and the heat on, whatever it may be. So that's kind of what we would charge for that. But also, if you can't afford it, we're not going to say no. Right. So I'm always very clear about that when it comes to the payment, that this is not, you're not paying me nor the church for this. It should be coming out of your own heart. And also reasonable what you can afford.
You know, it's funny because while you're sitting here talking and I'm thinking, oh my God, you know, we buried Anna Locks, and I thought, I don't remember. I think Mike was in charge of the funeral, but maybe her cousin was. Did we pay you anything, you know? But now I remember she planned her own funeral and it was all written down, and to the priest, to the church was on the bill.
Yeah.
I don't remember how much she paid, but it was there.
Yeah. I think it's appreciated, but also like, I think sometimes it's just way too much, because like, honestly, you can say, well, you put a lot of time into these things. That may be true. I mean, if you do like everything between meeting with the family, prepping for the homily, doing the mass in the middle, all in all, you're probably takes about 4 to 6 hours altogether, right? So $200 for 4 to 6 hours, what is that? About $50 an hour. I mean, I wasn't even make that a phony. So it's like, I don't know. This is kind of like, I don't know earlier. I don't know. I like I said, I tend to more default to say, look, you don't have to give me anything you don't want to, but it should come. The point is, it should come from your own heart and what's reasonable for you to afford. In other words, if I don't get anything, I'm not going to say no to you, because typically I don't get it till after the fact anyway. If I get anything, so I'm not. So you already kind of got the service regardless, but still, I don't. To me, it just seems kind of underhanded.
Well, the family just probably appreciates the fact that, you know, you did put in all that time to prepare it. And
I agree. And to tell you the truth, I mean, and I the other thing too, I'm very conscious that I think some of my brother priests, they do make their living sometimes on those things. I mean, we don't get a lot of money as a priest. I mean, that's true, but also too, like, I don't want to destroy for anyone else, but also personally, like, if I really wanted money, I would just stay where I was. You know, I mean, that's what it comes down to. But I don't know. For me, I think it's just personal for each priest. They have to kind of wrestle with that, determine that. But I just think it's kind of weird that a lot of our funeral parlors in the area, they already have that charge, and it's not coming from anywhere, from the priest or from the church.
What they decide.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how they make this. And again, I don't know what they're actually. From what I understand,
no idea. I can't remember what.
Yeah, from what I understand, whatever they ask for, they give. They give to the church and to the minister. But I don't know. To me, it just seems like they should probably ask us first. I don't know. That's just me personally. I hate talking about that with families, though. I really do. But some people, I mean, it's all. But also, I think for some people, it kind of gives them some closure. Finality. It's just got a burden to take off their plate sometimes. And so, I mean, seeing the same thing, like I also, the option I give families too is, if you don't, it's a lot to actually choose, and especially when you're going through a time of mourning, it can be difficult. And so it's good that if you plan ahead, that's one thing. You have someone who plans ahead, gets all squared away with them and do good. But I also understand too that you have so many options here. Would it just be easy for me to choose for you? I'm okay doing that. Between Mary Beth and I, we can make sure it's going to be beautiful, it's going to be good, and also takes that burden off your plate. And people have taken me up on that too. It kind of depends. But some, they really, and part of that's in here too is engagement of the mourners. That's part of the ministry. Is that there should be offered to help plan. That I'm supposed to do that. But I also say, if it's hard for you, I'm more than happy to help you with that. It just depends on the people. It really depends on where they're at and where they're in their process of mourning and what's easiest for them. Because you don't want to burn anyone either. So good. All right.
This has not really anything to do with the burials and stuff, but why are St. Peter and Paul linked together? Like St. Peter and Paul Church is linked together. I mean, why are they linked together?
They even have the same feast day. Yeah, well, part of that's because they were martyred in Rome.
Okay.
Right, so they're both martyrs in Rome. But also too, I mean, the ministries and their their missions were very similar. Peter was generally considered to be ministering to the people of Israel, the Jews, while Paul was considered to be minister of the Gentiles, right? And so, even though Peter was the first Pope of Rome, if you look at a lot of churches were actually established by Paul throughout the Mediterranean, Europe, even into Asia Minor. And so it was kind of a both-and understanding. That was both of them that was necessary to actually build up the church and spread Christendom throughout the entire world. And so, but also too, I mean, they were both apostles. So, but there's even a deference of Paul to Peter, right?
Paul was one of the 12.
Well, in his conversion, right, and because of the mission he was given by Jesus directly after the resurrection, okay, he is considered one of the bishops too. Okay. Yeah. Even though Matthias took over Judas' position, he was already established when Paul got converted. Paul would be considered an apostle.
We just got back from an Eastern European cruise, Eastern Mediterranean, and we went to Philippa.
Yeah, Philippi. Yeah. So well,
Philippines, and we went to.
Was it Philippi?
Philippi.
Which Philippi? Because there's a few. There's
well, St. Paul was
Philippi Maritime.
Well, what St. Paul had a prison.
That's Philippi Maritime. Yeah, Maritime. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we were there, and we were in Ephesus.
Yeah.
And there was one other place we were that I felt like I was walking in the footsteps of Paul. But now when I'm reading the readings, his letters, I'm feeling it more. I'm getting it more because he was writing to the people after he'd been there. So
right. Yeah. We visited Philippi Maritime. We were in Israel as deacons, and we were there in winter, which is now when you guys just go?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's interesting because the winds change over the Mediterranean depending on the time of year.
Okay.
And so when we visit in winter, so the winds are actually blowing easterly, but in the summer they blow westerly. And so that's why whenever people were traveling out of Philippi Maritime, they'd always travel out in the summer and back in the winter. And so that was kind of fascinating because Paul had to spend some time there just because the winds weren't correct to get him to Rome.
Okay, well, they didn't, mention that.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, it's actually an interesting structure they had. I mean, and it was really kind of fun. We were there, and we were like walking through like on the beach there, and that wind was intense. Mm. Like me, even myself, if I would have jumped up, I probably would have blown back 10 feet. Mm. It was crazy.
We didn't have wind.
Oh boy, it was something else. Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
it was something else. But yeah, it was. Yeah, Paul's very, very instrumental. But yeah, you can see like even the very beginning, there's this deference of Paul to Peter, especially when it came to Peter's acceptance of the Gentiles. So we read in Acts there was this kind of disagreement that when Peter was with the Gentiles, he would act with like Gentiles and eat pork or whatever else. Then he was with the Jews, he would refrain from all that stuff, and Paul kind of like called him out. And kind of, but also tried to refer to his decision. He said, like, it's your call. You're the head of the apostles, but you really need to kind of think about what you're doing. And so, their dynamic is very interesting. So good, good, wonderful. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate you coming. And we will see.
Thank you.
So you're not at 6 a.m., huh?
Not this week, no.